The United States Coast Guard is a branch of the United States Armed Forces and one of the country's 7 uniformed services. The Coast Guard is a maritime, military, multi-mission service unique among the U.S. military branches for having a maritime law enforcement mission and a federal regulatory agency mission as part of its mission set. It operates under the U.S. Department of Homeland Security during peacetime, and can be transferred to the U.S. Department of the Navy by the U.S. President at any time, or by the U.S. Congress during times of war. To date, this has happened twice, in 1917 and 1941, during World War I and World War II, respectively. Created by Congress on August 4, 1790 at the request of Alexander Hamilton as the Revenue Marine, it is the oldest continuous seagoing service of the United States, although the U.S. Navy lists its founding as 1775, the formation of the Continental Navy. However, that was disbanded in 1785, and the modern U.S. Navy in its present form was founded in 1794. As Secretary of the Treasury, Hamilton headed the Revenue Marine, whose original purpose was that of a collector of customs duties in the nation's seaports. By the 1860s the service was known as the U.S. Revenue Cutter Service, and the term Revenue Marine gradually fell into disuse. The Coast Guard was formed from the merger of the Revenue Cutter Service and the U.S. Lifesaving Service on January 28, 1915, as an organization under the U.S. Department of the Treasury. As one of the country's 5 armed services, the Coast Guard has been involved in every war from 1790 up to the Iraq War and the war in Afghanistan. As of 2012 the Coast Guard had approximately 42,000 men and women on active duty, 7,900 reservists, 32,000 auxiliarists, and 8,700 full-time civilian employees. In terms of size, the U.S. Coast Guard by itself is the world's 12th largest naval force. The Coast Guard's legal authority differs from the other 4 armed services. It operates simultaneously under Title 10 of the U.S. Code and its other organic authorities, for example Title 6, 14, 19, 33, 46, etc. Because of its legal authority, the Coast Guard can conduct military operations under the U.S. Department of Defense or directly for the President in accordance with Title 14 U.S.C. 1A-3. The Coast Guard's enduring roles are maritime safety, security, and stewardship. To carry out those roles the Coast Guard has 11 statutory missions as defined in 6 USCAA millisecond 468, which include enforcing U.S. law in the world's largest exclusive economic zone of 3.4 million square miles. The Coast Guard motto is Semper Paratus. Mission. Role, authority as an armed service. The 5 uniformed services that make up the armed forces are defined in Title 10 of the United States Code. The term armed forces means the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, and Coast Guard. The Coast Guard is further defined by Title 14 of the United States Code. The Coast Guard as established January 28, 1915, shall be a military service and a branch of the armed forces of the United States at all times. The Coast Guard shall be a service in the Department of Homeland Security, except when operating as a service in the Navy. Coast Guard organization and operation is as set forth in Title 33 of the Code of Federal Regulations. On November 25, 2002, the Homeland Security Act was signed into law by U.S. President George W. Bush, designating the Coast Guard to be placed under the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. The transfer of administrative control from the U.S. Department of Transportation to the U.S. Department of Homeland Security was completed the following year, on March 1, 2003. The U.S. Coast Guard reports directly to the Secretary of Homeland Security. However, under 14 USCAA millisecond 3 as amended by Section 211 of the Coast Guard and Maritime Transportation Act of 2006, upon the declaration of war and when Congress so directs in the declaration, or when the President directs, the Coast Guard operates under the Department of Defense as a service in the Department of the Navy. As members of the military, Coast Guardsmen on active and reserve service are subject to the Uniform Code of Military Justice and receive the same pay and allowances as members of the same pay grades in the other uniformed services. The service has participated in every major U.S. conflict from 1790 through today, including landing troops on D-Day and on the Pacific Islands in World War II, in extensive patrols and shore bombardment during the Vietnam War, and multiple roles in Operation Iraqi Freedom. Maritime interception operations, coastal security, transportation security, and law enforcement detachments have been its major roles in recent conflicts in Iraq. On October 17, 2007, the Coast Guard joined with the U.S. Navy and U.S. Marine Corps to adopt a new maritime strategy called a Cooperative Strategy for 21st Century Sea Power that raised the notion of prevention of war to the same philosophical level as the conduct of war. This new strategy charted a course for the Navy, Coast Guard and Marine Corps to work collectively with each other and international partners to prevent regional crises, man-made or natural, from occurring, or reacting quickly should one occur to avoid negative impacts to the United States. During the launch of the new U.S. Maritime Strategy at the International Sea Power Symposium at the U.S. Naval War College in 2007, Coast Guard Commandant Admiral Thad Allen said the new maritime strategy reinforced the time-honored missions the service has carried out in the United States since 1790. It reinforces the Coast Guard maritime strategy of safety, security and stewardship, and it reflects not only the global reach of our maritime services but the need to integrate and synchronize and act with our coalition and international partners to not only win wars, but to prevent wars, Allen said. Authority as a law enforcement agency. Title 14 U.S.C., Section 2 authorizes the Coast Guard to enforce federal law. This authority is further defined in Title 14 U.S.C., Section 89, which gives law enforcement powers to all Coast Guard commissioned officers, warrant officers, and petty officers. Unlike the other branches of the United States Armed Forces, which are prevented from acting in a law enforcement capacity by Title 18 U.S.C., Section 1385, the Posse Comitatus Act, and Department of Defense policy, the Coast Guard is exempt from and not subject to the restrictions of the Posse Comitatus Act. Further law enforcement authority is given by Title 14 U.S.C., Section 143 and Title 19 U.S.C., Section 1401, which empower U.S. Coast Guard active and reserve commissioned officers, warrant officers, and petty officers as federal customs officers. This places them under Title 19 U.S.C., Section 1589A, which grants customs officers general federal law enforcement authority, including the authority to the U.S. Government Accountability Office report to the House of Representatives. Committee on the Judiciary on its 2006 survey of federal civilian law enforcement functions and authorities, identified the Coast Guard as one of 104 federal components that employed law enforcement officers. The report also included a summary table of the authorities of the Coast Guard's 192 special agents and 3,780 maritime law enforcement boarding officers. Coast Guardsmen have the legal authority to carry their service-issued firearms on and off base. This is rarely done in practice, however. At many Coast Guard stations, commanders prefer to have all service-issued weapons in armories. Still, one court has held that Coast Guard boarding officers are qualified law enforcement officers authorized to carry personal firearms off-duty for self-defense. National Response Center, operated by the Coast Guard, the National Response Center is the sole U.S. government point of contact for reporting all radiological, oil, chemical, biological, and etiological pollution discharges into the environment anywhere in the United States and its territories. In addition to gathering and distributing spill data for federal on-scene coordinators and serving as the Communications and Operations Center for the National Response Team, the NRC maintains agreements with a variety of federal entities to make additional notifications regarding incidents meeting established trigger criteria. The NRC also takes terrorist suspicious activity reports and maritime security breach reports. Details on the NRC organization and specific responsibilities can be found in the National Oil and Hazardous Substances Pollution Contingency Plan. The Marine Information for Safety and Law Enforcement database system is managed and used by the Coast Guard for tracking pollution and safety incidents in the nation's ports. History. The roots of the Coast Guard lie in the United States Revenue Cutter Service established by Alexander Hamilton under the Department of the Treasury on August 4, 1790. The first Coast Guard station was in Newburyport, Massachusetts. Until the re-establishment of the Navy in 1798, the Revenue Cutter Service was the only naval force of the early United States. It was established to collect taxes from a brand new nation of patriot smugglers. When the officers were out at sea, they were told to crack down on piracy and to rescue any mariners in distress. First Fleet is a term occasionally used as an informal reference to the Coast Guard, although there is no indication that the United States has ever officially used this designation with reference either to the Coast Guard or any element of the Navy. The informal appellation honors the fact that between 1790 and 1798, there was no United States Navy, and the cutters that were the predecessors of the Coast Guard were the only warships protecting the coast, trade, and maritime interests of the new republic. The modern Coast Guard can be said to date to 1915, when the Revenue Cutter Service merged with the U.S. Lifesaving Service when Congress formalized the existence of the new organization. In 1939, the Lighthouse Service was brought under the Coast Guard's purview. In 1942, the Bureau of Marine Inspection and Navigation was transferred to the Coast Guard. In 1967, the Coast Guard moved from the U.S. Department of the Treasury to the newly formed U.S. Department of Transportation, an arrangement that lasted until it was placed under the U.S. Department of Homeland Security in 2002 as part of legislation designed to more efficiently protect American interests following the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001. In times of war, the Coast Guard or individual components of it can operate as a service of the Department of the Navy. This arrangement has a broad historical basis, as the Coast Guard has been involved in wars as diverse as the War of 1812, the Mexican-American War, and the American Civil War, in which the cutter Harriet Lane fired the first naval shots attempting to relieve besieged Fort Sumter. The last time the Coast Guard operated as a whole within the Navy was in World War II. More often, military and combat units within the Coast Guard will operate under Navy or Joint Operational Control, while other Coast Guard units will remain under the Department of Homeland Security. Organization. The new Department of Homeland Security headquarters complex is being built on the grounds of the former St. Elizabeth's Hospital in the Anacostia section of southeast Washington, across the Anacostia River from former Coast Guard headquarters. Shore establishments. Shore establishment commands exist to support and facilitate the mission of the sea and air assets. U.S. Coast Guard headquarters is located in southwest Washington, D.C. Other shore establishments are Coast Guard sectors, Coast Guard stations, Coast Guard air stations, and the United States Coast Guard Yard. Training centers include the United States Coast Guard Academy, Training Center Petaluma, Training Center Cape May, Coast Guard Aviation Technical Training Center, Coast Guard Aviation Training Center Mobile, and Training Center Yorktown. Personnel. The formal name for a uniformed member of the Coast Guard is Coast Guardsman, irrespective of gender. Coastie is an informal term commonly used to refer to current or former Coast Guard personnel. In 2008, the term Guardian was introduced as an alternative, but was later dropped. Admiral Robert J. Papp, Jr. stated that it was his belief that no commandant had the authority to change what members of the Coast Guard are called, as the term Coast Guardsman is found in Title 14 USC, which established the Coast Guard in 1915. Team Coast Guard refers to the four components of the Coast Guard as a whole: regular, reserve, auxiliary, and Coast Guard civilian employees. Commissioned officers. Commissioned officers in the Coast Guard hold pay grades ranging from 01 to 010 and have the same rank structure as the Navy. Officers holding the rank of ensign through lieutenant commander are considered junior officers, commanders and captains are considered senior officers, and rear admirals through admirals are considered flag officers. The Commandant of the Coast Guard is the only member of the Coast Guard to hold the rank of admiral. The Coast Guard does not have medical officers or chaplains of its own. Instead, chaplains from the U.S. Navy, as well as officers from the U.S. Public Health Service commissioned corps are assigned to the Coast Guard to perform chaplain-related functions and medical-related functions, respectively. These officers wear Coast Guard uniforms but replace the Coast Guard insignia with that of their own service. Warrant officers, highly qualified enlisted personnel in pay grades E6 through E9 with a minimum of 8 years experience can compete each year for appointment as warrant officers. Successful candidates are chosen by a board and then commissioned as chief warrant officers in one of 16 specialities. Over time, chief warrant officers may be promoted to CWO3 and CWO4. The ranks of warrant officer and chief warrant officer are not currently used in the Coast Guard. Chief warrant officers may also compete for the Chief Warrant Officer to Lieutenant program. If selected, the warrant officer will be promoted to lieutenant. The E designates over 4 years active duty service as a warrant officer or enlisted member and entitles the member to a higher rate of pay than other lieutenants. Enlisted personnel, enlisted members of the Coast Guard have pay grades from E1 to E9 and also follow the same rank structure as the Navy. Enlisted members in pay grades of E4 and higher are considered petty officers and follow career development paths very similar to those of Navy petty officers. Petty officers in pay grade E7 and higher are chief petty officers and must attend the Coast Guard Chief Petty Officer Academy, or an equivalent Department of Defense school, in order to be advanced to pay grade E8. The basic themes of the school are professionalism, leadership, communications, systems thinking and lifelong learning. Women in the Coast Guard. SPARS was the United States Coast Guard Women's Reserve created on November 23, 1942 with the signing of Public Law 773 by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The name is a contraction of the Coast Guard motto Semper Paratus and its English translation, Always Ready. The name also refers to a spar in nautical usage. Like the other women's reserves such as the Women's Army Corps and the Waves, it was created to free men from stateside service in order to fight overseas. Its first director was Captain Dorothy C. Stratton, who is credited with creating the name for the organization. The cutter USCG CA spar is named for the spars. Training, officer training. The U.S. Coast Guard Academy is a 4-year service academy located in New London, Connecticut. Approximately 225 cadets graduate each year, receiving a Bachelor of Science degree and a commission as an ensign in the Coast Guard. Graduates are obligated to serve a minimum of 5 years on active duty. Most graduates are assigned to duty aboard Coast Guard cutters immediately after graduation, either as deck watch officers or as engineer officers in training. Smaller numbers are assigned directly to flight training at Naval Air Station Pensacola, Florida, or to shore duty at Coast Guard sector, district, or area headquarters units. In addition to the academy, prospective officers, who already hold a college degree, may enter the Coast Guard through Officer Candidate School, also located at the Coast Guard Academy. OCS is a 17-week course of instruction that prepares candidates to serve effectively as officers in the Coast Guard. In addition to indoctrinating students into a military lifestyle, OCS provides a wide range of highly technical information necessary to perform the duties of a Coast Guard officer. Graduates of OCS are usually commissioned as ensigns, but some with advanced graduate degrees may enter as lieutenants or lieutenants. Graduating OCS officers entering active duty are required to serve a minimum of 3 years, while graduating reserve officers are required to serve 4 years. Graduates may be assigned to a cutter, flight training, a staff job, or an operations ashore billet. OCS is the primary channel through which the Coast Guard enlisted grades ascend to the Commissioned Officer Corps. Lawyers, engineers, intelligence officers, military aviators holding commissions in other branches of the U.S. Armed Forces requesting inter-service transfers to the Coast Guard, graduates of maritime academies, and certain other individuals may also receive an officer's commission in the Coast Guard through the Direct Commission Officer Program. Depending on the specific program and the background of the individual, the course is 3, 4 or 5 weeks long. The first week of the 5-week course is an indoctrination week. The DCO program is designed to commission officers with highly specialized professional training or certain kinds of previous military experience. Unlike the other military services, the Coast Guard does not have a reserve officers training corps program. Recruit training: newly enlisted personnel are sent to 8 weeks of recruit training at Coast Guard Training Center Cape May in Cape May, New Jersey. New recruits arrive at Sexton Hall and remain there for 3 days of initial processing, which includes haircuts, shots, uniform issue, and other necessary entrance procedures. During this initial processing period, the new recruits are led by temporary company commanders. These temporary company commanders are tasked with teaching the new recruits how to march and preparing them to enter into their designated company. The temporary company commanders typically do not enforce any physical activity such as push-ups or crunches. When the initial processing is complete, the new seaman recruits are introduced to their permanent company commanders who will remain with them until the end of training. There is typically a designated lead company commander and 2 support company commanders. The balance of the 8-week boot camp is spent in learning teamwork and developing physical skills. An introduction of how the Coast Guard operates with special emphasis on the Coast Guard's core values is an important part of the training. The current 9 recruit training objectives are: self-discipline, military skills, marksmanship, vocational skills and academics, military bearing, physical fitness and wellness, water survival and swim qualifications, esprit de corps, core values, service schools. Following graduation from recruit training, most members are sent to their first unit while they await orders to attend advanced training in Class A schools. At A schools, Coast Guard enlisted personnel are trained in their chosen rating. Rating is a Coast Guard and Navy term for enlisted skills synonymous with the Army's and Marine Corps military occupation codes and Air Force's Air Force Specialty Code. Members who earned high ASVAB scores or who were otherwise guaranteed an A school of choice while enlisting may go directly to their A school upon graduation from boot camp. Civilian personnel: the Coast Guard employs over 7,700 civilians in over 200 different job types including Coast Guard Investigative Service Special Agents, lawyers, engineers, technicians, administrative personnel, tradesmen, and federal firefighters. Civilian employees work at various levels in the Coast Guard to support its various missions. Equipment: cutters. Originally, the U.S. Coast Guard used the term cutter in its traditional sense, as a type of small sailing ship. Today it officially uses the term for any vessel that has a permanently assigned crew and accommodations for the extended support of that crew, and includes only and all vessels of 65 feet or more in length. Polar-class icebreaker: there are 3 WAGBs used for icebreaking and research, though only 2, the heavy 399-foot Polar Star and the newer medium-class 420-foot Healy, are active. Polar Sea is located in Seattle, Washington but is not currently in active service. National Security Cutter: these are a new class of 418-foot cutters, also known as the Legend class, intended to eventually replace the aging Hamilton-class high-endurance cutters. High-endurance cutter: these are 378-foot Hamilton-class cutters. Missions include law enforcement, search and rescue, and military defense. Medium-endurance cutter: these are mostly the 210-foot Reliance class, and the 270-foot Famous class cutters, although the 283-foot Alex Haley also falls into this category. Primary missions are law enforcement, search and rescue, and military defense. USCG Mackinac, a 240-foot heavy icebreaker built for operations on the Great Lakes. USCG Eagle, a 295-foot sailing bark used as a training ship for Coast Guard Academy cadets and Coast Guard officer candidates. She was originally built in Germany as Horst vessel, and was seized by the United States as a prize of war in 1945. Seagoing buoy tender: these 180 and 225-foot ships are used to maintain aids to navigation and also assist with law enforcement and search and rescue. Coastal buoy tender: the 175-foot Keeper-class coastal buoy tenders are used to maintain coastal aids to navigation. Sentinel-class cutter: The 154-foot Sentinel class was previously known as the Fast Response Cutter class and is used for search and rescue work and law enforcement. Bay-class icebreaking tug, 140-foot icebreakers used primarily for domestic icebreaking missions. Other missions include search and rescue, law enforcement, and aids to navigation maintenance. Patrol boats. There are two classes of WPBs currently in service. The 110-foot Island-class patrol boats and the 87-foot Marine Protector-class patrol boats, aircraft. The Coast Guard operates approximately 204 fixed and rotary wing aircraft from 24 Coast Guard air stations throughout the contiguous United States, Alaska, Hawaii, and Puerto Rico. Most of these air stations are tenant activities at civilian airports, several of which are former Air Force bases and naval air stations, although several are also independent military facilities. Coast Guard air stations are also located on active naval air stations, Air National Guard bases, and Army airfields. Coast Guard aviators receive primary and advanced flight training with their Navy and Marine Corps counterparts at NAS Whiting Field, Florida, and NAS Corpus Christi, Texas, and are considered naval aviators. After receiving naval aviator wings, Coast Guard pilots, with the exception of those slated to fly the HC-130, report to USCG Aviation Training Center Mobile, Alabama to receive 12 weeks of specialized training in the Coast Guard fleet aircraft they will operate. HC-130 pilots report to Little Rock AFB, Arkansas, for Joint C-130 training under the auspices of the 314th Airlift Wing of the U.S. Air Force. Fixed-wing aircraft operate from air stations on long-duration missions. Helicopters operate from air stations and can deploy on a number of different cutters. Helicopters can rescue people or intercept vessels smuggling migrants or narcotics. Since the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, the Coast Guard has developed a more prominent role in national security and now has armed helicopters operating in high-risk areas for the purpose of maritime law enforcement and anti-terrorism. The Coast Guard is now developing an unmanned aerial vehicle program that will utilize the MQ-9 Reaper platform for Homeland Security and search-rescue operations. To support this endeavor, the Coast Guard has partnered with the Navy and U.S. Customs and Border Protection to study existing emerging unmanned aerial system capabilities within their respective organizations. As these systems mature, research and operational experience gleaned from this joint effort will enable the Coast Guard to develop its own cutter and land-based UAS capabilities. Fixed-wing aircraft, Lockheed HC-130H Hercules, Lockheed HC-130J Super Hercules, CASA HC-144A Ocean Sentry, Dassault HU-25AD Guardian, rotary wing aircraft, Sikorsky HH/MH-60 joules per ton Jayhawk, or copyright Rospartiel MH-65CE Dolphin, fixed-wing VIP transport aircraft assigned to CGAS Washington, D.C., VC-37A long-range command and control aircraft. Boats. The Coast Guard operates about 1,400 boats, defined as any vessel less than 65 feet long, which generally operate near shore and on inland waterways. The Coast Guard boat fleet includes, motor lifeboat, the Coast Guard's 47-foot primary heavy weather boat used for search and rescue as well as law enforcement and homeland security. Response boat, a Euro-medium, a new multi-mission 45-foot vessel intended to replace the 41-foot utility boat. 170 planned, special-purpose craft, a Euro nearshore lifeboat, only 2 built. Shallow draft, 42-foot lifeboat substituted for the 47-foot motor lifeboat, based at Chatham, Massachusetts, utility boat, a 41-foot general-purpose boat used for nearly all Coast Guard missions. Long-range interceptor, a 36-foot high-speed launch that can be launched from the stern ramps of the larger deep-water cutters. Aids to navigation boats, various designs ranging from 26 to 55 feet used to maintain aids to navigation. Special-purpose craft, a Euro law enforcement, intended to operate in support of specialized law enforcement missions, utilizing 300 horsepower Mercury Marine engines. The SPCLE is 33 feet long and capable of speeds in excess of 50 knots and operations more than 30 miles from shore. Response boat: a Euro small, a 25-foot high-speed boat, for a variety of missions, including search and rescue, port security and law enforcement duties. Transportable port security boat, a 25-foot well-armed boat used by port security units for force protection. SPCSW special purpose craft, shallow water, 24 feet, over-the-horizon boat, a 23-foot rigid hull inflatable boat used by medium and high-endurance cutters and specialized units. Short-range prosecutor, a 23-foot rigid hull inflatable boat that can be launched from a stern launching ramp on the national security cutters. Weapons. The U.S. Coast Guard uses a wide variety of small arms. Handguns, shotguns, and rifles are used to arm boat crew and boarding team members, and machine guns are mounted aboard cutters, boats, and helicopters. Common small arms include SIG Sauer P229, a dark .40 S&W pistol, Remington M870P 12-gauge shotgun, M16A2 rifle, M4 carbine, M14 tactical rifle, FN M240 machine gun, M2 heavy machine gun. Units within the Deployable Operations Group also employ specialized weapons including the Mk18 carbine, Mk11 precision rifle, and M203 grenade launcher. Marksmen from the Helicopter Interdiction Tactical Squadron and law enforcement detachments use a variant of the Barrett M107.50 caliber rifle to disable the engines on fleeing boats. Symbols, core values. The Coast Guard, like the other armed services of the United States, has a set of core values that serve as basic ethical guidelines for all Coast Guard active duty, reservists, auxiliarists, and civilians. The Coast Guard core values are: the Guardian ethos. In 2008, the Coast Guard introduced the Guardian ethos. As the Commandant, Admiral Allen noted in a message to all members of the Coast Guard, he ethos defines the essence of the Coast Guard and could be viewed as the contract the Coast Guard and its members make with the nation and its citizens. The ethos was as follows. The Coast Guard ethos. In an Al-Coast message effective December 1, 2011, the Commandant, Admiral Papp, directed that the language of Guardian ethos be superseded by the Coast Guard ethos in an effort to use terminology that would help with the identity of personnel serving in the Coast Guard. The term Coast Guardsman is the correct form of address used in Title 14 USC and is the form that has been used historically. Creed of the United States Coast Guardsmen. The Creed of the United States Coast Guardsmen was written by Vice Admiral Harry G. Hamlet, who served as Commandant of the Coast Guard from 1932 to 1936. You have to go out, but you don't have to come back. This unofficial motto of the Coast Guard dates to an 1899 United States Life-Saving Service regulation, which states in part, in attempting a rescue, he will not desist from his efforts until by actual trial, the impossibility of effecting a rescue is demonstrated. The statement of the keeper that he did not try to use the boat because the sea or surf was too heavy will not be accepted, unless attempts to launch it were actually made and failed. The regulation was silent as to what happens to the rescuer if the attempt fails. Coast Guard Ensign. The Coast Guard Ensign was first flown by the Revenue Cutter Service in 1799 to distinguish revenue cutters from merchant ships. An August 1, 1799 order issued by Secretary of the Treasury, Oliver Wolcott, Jr. specified that the ensign would be 16 perpendicular stripes, alternate red and white, the union of the ensign to be the arms of the United States in a dark blue on a white field. This ensign became familiar in American waters and served as the sign of authority for the Revenue Cutter Service until the early 20th century. The ensign was originally intended to be flown only on revenue cutters and boats connected with the Customs Service, but over the years it was found flying atop custom houses as well, and the practice became a requirement in 1874. On June 7, 1910, President William Howard Taft issued an executive order adding an emblem to the ensign flown by the revenue cutters to distinguish it from what is now called the Customs ensign flown from the custom houses. The emblem was changed to the official seal of the Coast Guard in 1927. The purpose of the ensign is to allow ship captains to easily recognize those vessels having legal authority to stop and board them. It is flown only as a symbol of law enforcement authority and is never carried as a parade standard. Coast Guard Standard. The Coast Guard Standard is used in parades and carries the battle honors of the Coast Guard. It was derived from the jag of the Coast Guard ensign, which was flown by revenue cutters. The emblem is a blue eagle from the coat of arms of the United States on a white field. Above the eagle are the words United States Coast Guard. Below the eagle is the motto, Semper Paratus, and the inscription 1790. Service mark. The racing stripe is borne by Coast Guard cutters, aircraft, and many boats. Red-hulled icebreaker cutters and most HH-65/MH-65 helicopters bear a narrow white bar, a narrow blue bar, and broad white bar, with the Coast Guard shield centered. Conversely, black-hulled cutters use the standard racing stripe. Auxiliary vessels maintained by the Coast Guard also carry the racing stripe, but in inverted colors and the auxiliary shield. The racing stripe, officially known as the service mark, was designed in 1964 by the Industrial Design Office of Raymond Louis Associates to give the Coast Guard a distinctive, modern image. Louis had designed the colors for the Air Force One fleet for Jackie Kennedy. President Kennedy was so impressed with his work, he suggested that the entire federal government needed his makeover and suggested that he start with the Coast Guard. First used in 1967, it consists of a narrow blue stripe, a narrow white stripe between, and a broad CG red bar with the Coast Guard shield centered. The stripes are counted at a 64-degree angle, coincidentally the year the racing stripe was designed. Similar racing stripe designs have been adopted for the use of other Coast Guards and maritime authorities and many other law enforcement and rescue agencies. Semper Paratus, the official march of the Coast Guard is Semper Paratus. Colors: two Pantone colors are named after the Coast Guard. They are used in the service mark. CG red is Pantone 179C. CG blue is Pantone 307C, uniforms. Prior to 1972, Coast Guard personnel wore the same uniforms as the Navy with distinctive Coast Guard insignia, primarily distinctive cap devices for officers and chief petty officers, incorporation of the Coast Guard shield in lieu of line or staff corps insignia for officers, and different buttons on dress uniforms. In 1972, the current Coast Guard service dress blue uniform was introduced for wear by both officers and enlisted personnel. The transition was completed during 1974. The uniform consists of a blue four-pocket single-breasted jacket and trousers. A light blue button-up shirt with a pointed collar, two front button flap pockets, and shoulder loops, along with a tie of the same shade as the jacket are worn with the uniform. Officer rank insignia parallels that of the Navy but with the gold Navy line star replaced with the gold Coast Guard shield and with the navy blue background color replaced by Coast Guard blue. Enlisted rank insignia is also similar to the Navy with the Coast Guard shield replacing the eagle on collar and cap devices. Group rate marks for junior enlisted members also follow Navy convention with white for seaman, red for fireman, and green for airman. In a departure from the Navy conventions, all petty officers E6 and below wear red chevrons and all chief petty officers wear gold. Unlike the Navy, there are no khaki uniforms, and all personnel wear the same color uniform. The SDB uniform may be worn year-round for business within the Coast Guard and for social occasions where the civilian equivalent is coat and tie. The tropical blue variation, worn in warm weather, omits the jacket and tie, and features a short-sleeve shirt with rank insignia on shoulder boards for officers, and pin-on collar insignia for petty officers. The tropical blue uniform may be worn year-round for general office wear and for visits between commands. It may be worn in lieu of the SDB uniform, but not to functions where civilian dress is coat and tie. Coast Guard officers also have dress white uniforms, nearly identical to the choker white uniforms worn by naval officers, typically used for formal parade and change of command ceremonies. For similar occasions enlisted members wear tropical blue, service dress blue, or full dress blue. Full dress blue replaces the light blue shirt with a white shirt, and full-size medals are worn on the jacket. A white belt may be worn for honor guards. Mess dress uniforms are worn by members for formal evening ceremonies. Like the officers' dress white uniforms, the mess dress uniforms are identical to those of the Navy, aside from Coast Guard-specific insignia. The current working uniform of the Coast Guard is the operational dress uniform. The ODU may be worn year-round primarily as a field utility and watch-standing uniform, and may be worn in an office environment. The ODU is similar to the battle dress uniform of other armed services, both in function and style. However, the ODU is in a solid dark blue with no camouflage pattern and does not have lower pockets on the blouse. The first-generation ODU, wearable until July 1, 2012, was worn tucked in. The second-generation ODU is worn untucked and has black Coast Guard insignia embroidered on the left shirt pocket as well as the side pockets of the trousers. The ODU is worn with composite-toed boots in most circumstances, but low-cut brown boat shoes may be prescribed for certain vessel boarding operations. A standard baseball-style ball cap is worn, embroidered in gold block lettering with U.S. Coast Guard. Units may also additionally authorize ball caps with the unit name embroidered for wear while on the unit. A foul-weather parka is the outerwear worn with the ODU. The former dark blue working uniform had been withdrawn from use by the Coast Guard but may be worn by auxiliarists until no longer serviceable. Coast Guard personnel serving in expeditionary combat units such as port security units, law enforcement detachments, and others, wear the camouflage utility uniform with a woodland or desert pattern color scheme based on the operational commander's guidance. An 8-point cap is worn with rank insignia. The camouflaged utility sun hat may be worn when prescribed by the operational commander, without rank insignia. All Coast Guardsmen wear the combination cap with all uniforms except the ODU and CUU. Company commanders at Training Center Cape may wear the traditional Smokey Bear-style campaign hat. The Coast Guard Pipe Band, a special musical unit composed of active, reserve and auxiliary Coast Guardsmen, wears a modified form of Highland dress, including kilt and sporran. It is, along with the band of the Air Force Reserve Pipe Band, one of only 2 kilted units in the United States military, excluding those maintained by state defense forces and service academies. The band's kilt is patterned in the official U.S. Coast Guard tartan. Cadets at the U.S. Coast Guard Academy have access to standard Coast Guard uniforms, including service dress blues and the ODU, however, also wear 2 different styles of parade dress uniforms. Full parade dress blue consists of navy blouses with banded collars and double rows of buttons, worn with matching navy trousers and a white peaked hat. Spring parade dress blue substitutes white trousers in lieu of navy. Issues: the Coast Guard faces several issues in the near future. Lack of coverage affects many areas with high maritime traffic. For example, local officials in Scituate, Massachusetts, have complained that there is no permanent Coast Guard station, and the presence of the Coast Guard in winter is vital. One reason for this lack of coverage is the relatively high cost of building storm-proof buildings on coastal property. The Cape Hatteras station was abandoned in 2005 after winter storms wiped out the 12-foot sand dune serving as its protection from the ocean. Faced with these issues, the Coast Guard has contracted with General Dynamics C4 system to provide a complete replacement of their 1970s-era radio equipment. Rescue 21 is the United States Coast Guard's advanced command, control and communications system. Created to improve the ability to assist mariners in distress and save lives and property at sea, the system is currently being installed in stages across the United States. The nation's existing maritime search and rescue communications system has been in operation since the early 1970s. Difficult to maintain, increasingly unreliable and prone to coverage gaps, this system no longer meets the safety needs of America's growing marine traffic. In addition, it is incapable of supporting the Coast Guard's new mission requirements for Homeland Security, which require close cooperation with Department of Defense agencies as well as federal, state and local law enforcement authorities. Modernizing this system enhances the safety and protection of America's waterways. lack of strength to meet its assigned missions is being met by a legislated increase in authorized strength from 39,000 to 45,000. In addition, the Volunteer Auxiliary acts as an air and surface resource in support of a variety of missions conducted by Coast Guard units. Aging vessels is another problem, with the Coast Guard still operating some of the oldest naval vessels in the world. In 2005, the Coast Guard terminated contracts to upgrade the 110-foot Island-class cutters to 123-foot cutters because of warping and distortion of the hulls. In late 2006, Admiral Thad Allen, Commandant of the Coast Guard, decommissioned all later-than-modified cutters due to dangerous conditions created by the lengthening of the hull, to include compromised watertight integrity. The Coast Guard has, as a result of the failed conversion, revised production schedules for the fast response cutter. Of the world's 40 largest navies and coast guards, the U.S. Coast Guard has the 38th oldest surface fleet. Live fire exercises by Coast Guard boat and cutter crews in U.S. waters of the Great Lakes was proposed in 2006 and attracted attention in the U.S. and Canada. The Coast Guard had proposed the establishment of 34 locations around the Great Lakes where live fire training using vessel-mounted machine guns were to be conducted periodically throughout the year. The Coast Guard said that these exercises are a critical part of proper crew training in support of the service's multiple missions on the Great Lakes, including law enforcement and anti-terrorism. Those who raised concerns about the firing exercises commented about safety concerns and that the impact on commercial shipping, tourism, recreational boating and the environment may be greater than what the Coast Guard had stated. The Coast Guard took public comment and conducted a series of 9 public meetings on this issue. After receiving more than 1,000 comments, mostly opposing the Coast Guard's plan, the Coast Guard announced that they were withdrawing their proposal for target practice on the Great Lakes, although a revised proposal may be made in the future. Deployable Operations Group. The Deployable Operations Group was a Coast Guard command established in July 2007. The DOG established a single command authority to rapidly provide the Coast Guard, Department of Homeland Security, Department of Defense, Department of Justice and other interagency operational commanders adaptive force packages drawn from the Coast Guard's deployable specialized force units. The DOG was disbanded in April 2013 and its deployable specialized forces units were placed under the control of area commanders. The planning for the unit began after the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, and culminated with its formation on July 20, 2007. Its missions include maritime law enforcement, anti-terrorism, port security, pollution response, and diving operations. There were over 25 specialized units within the Deployable Operations Group including the Maritime Security Response Team, Maritime Safety and Security Teams, Law Enforcement Detachments, Port Security Units, the National Strike Force, and Regional Dive Lockers. The DOG also managed Coast Guard personnel assigned to the Navy Expeditionary Combat Command and was involved in the selection of Coast Guard candidates to attend Navy BARDES and serve with Navy SEAL teams. Coast Guard Reserve. The United States Coast Guard Reserve is the reserve military force of the Coast Guard. The Coast Guard Reserve was founded on February 19, 1941. Coast Guard reservists normally drill 2 days a month and an additional 12 days of active duty each year, although many perform additional drill and active duty periods, to include those mobilized to extended active duty. Coast Guard reservists possess the same training and qualifications as their active duty counterparts, and as such, can be found augmenting active duty Coast Guard units every day. During the Vietnam War and shortly thereafter, the Coast Guard considered abandoning the reserve program, but the force was instead reoriented into force augmentation, where its principal focus was not just reserve operations, but to add to the readiness and mission execution of everyday active duty personnel. Since September 11, 2001, over 8,500 reservists have been activated and served on tours of active duty, to include deployments to the Persian Gulf and also as parts of Department of Defense combatant commands such as the U.S. Northern and Central Commands. Coast Guard port security units are entirely staffed with reservists, except for 5 to 7 active duty personnel. Additionally, most of the staffing the Coast Guard provides to the Navy Expeditionary Combat Command are reservists. The reserve is managed by the Acting Director of Reserve and Leadership, Rear Admiral David R. Callahan. Coast Guard Auxiliary. The United States Coast Guard Auxiliary is the uniformed volunteer component of the Coast Guard, established on June 23, 1939 by an act of Congress as the United States Coast Guard Reserve. It was redesignated as the Auxiliary on February 19, 1941. It works within the Coast Guard in carrying out its non-combatant and non-law enforcement missions. Auxiliarists are subject to direction from the Commandant of the Coast Guard, making them unique among all federal volunteers. As of 2012, there were approximately 32,000 active auxiliarists. The Coast Guard has assigned primary responsibility for many recreational boating safety tasks to the auxiliary, including public boating safety education and voluntary vessel safety checks called courtesy marine examinations and personal watercraft safety checks. Prior to 1997, auxiliarists were limited to those tasks and on-water patrols supporting recreational boating safety. In 1997, however, new legislation authorized the auxiliary to participate in any and all Coast Guard missions except direct military and direct law enforcement. Auxiliarists may support the law enforcement mission of the Coast Guard but may not directly participate in it, and auxiliarists and their vessels are not permitted to carry a weapon while serving in any auxiliary capacity. Auxiliarists use their own vessel, once it is registered as a Coast Guard facility, in Coast Guard missions. Medals and honors. One Coast Guardsman, Douglas Albert Munro, has earned the Medal of Honor, the highest military award of the United States. 55 Coast Guardsmen have earned the Navy Cross and numerous men and women have earned the Distinguished Flying Cross. The highest peacetime decoration awarded within the Coast Guard is the Homeland Security Distinguished Service Medal. Prior to the transfer of the Coast Guard to the Department of Homeland Security, the highest peacetime decoration was the Department of Transportation Distinguished Service Medal. The highest unit award available is the Presidential Unit Citation. In wartime, members of the Coast Guard are eligible to receive the Navy version of the Medal of Honor. A Coast Guard Medal of Honor is authorized but has not yet been developed or issued. In May 2006, at the change of command ceremony when Admiral Thad Allen took over as Commandant, President George W. Bush awarded the entire Coast Guard, including the Coast Guard Auxiliary, the Coast Guard Presidential Unit Citation with Hurricane Device, for its efforts during and after Hurricane Katrina and Tropical Storm Rita. Organizations: Coast Guard Aviation Association. Those who have piloted or flown in Coast Guard aircraft under official flight orders may join the Coast Guard Aviation Association, which was formerly known as the Ancient Order of the Pterodactyl. The Ancient Albatross Award is presented to the active duty USCG member who qualified as an aviator earlier than any other person who is still serving. Separate enlisted and officer awards are given. Coast Guard CW Operators Association. The Coast Guard CW Operators Association is a membership organization comprising primarily former members of the United States Coast Guard who held the enlisted rating of radioman or telecommunications specialist, and who employed International Morse code in their routine communications duties on Coast Guard cutters and at shore stations. USCG Chief Petty Officers Association. Members of this organization unite to assist members and dependents in need, assist with Coast Guard recruiting efforts, support the aims and goals of the Coast Guard Chief Petty Officers Academy, keep informed on Coast Guard matters, and assemble for social amenities. And include Chief, Senior Chief, and Master Chief Petty Officers, active, reserve and retired. Membership is also open to all Chief Warrant Officers and officers who have served as a Chief Petty Officer. USCG Chief Warrant and Warrant Officers Association, established in 1929, the Chief Warrant and Warrant Officers Association, United States Coast Guard represents Coast Guard warrant and Chief Warrant Officers to the Congress, White House and the Department of Homeland Security. Additionally, the association communicates with the Coast Guard leadership on matters of concern to Coast Guard Chief Warrant Officers. Notable Coast Guardsmen. Numerous celebrities have served in the Coast Guard, including tennis player Jack Raymer, golfer Arnold Palmer, all-star baseball player Sid Gordon, boxer Jack Dempsey, musicians Kai Winding, Rudy Vallee, Daryl Adams, and Tom Waits. Actors Buddy Ebsen, Sid Caesar, Victor Mature, Richard Cromwell, Alan Hale, Jr., William Hopper, Beau Bridges, Cesar Romero. Author Alex Haley. And Senator Claiborne Pell. Vice Admiral Thad Allen in 2005 was named Principal Federal Officer to oversee recovery efforts in the Gulf region after Hurricane Katrina. After promotion to Admiral, on the eve of his retirement as Commandant, Allen again received national visibility after being named National Incident Commander overseeing the response efforts of the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. Former Coast Guard officers have been appointed to numerous civilian government offices. After retiring as Commandant of the Coast Guard in 2002, Admiral James Loy went on to serve as Administrator of the Transportation Security Administration and later as Deputy Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security. Admiral Loy was by no means the only Coast Guard officer who was later appointed to a civilian government position. Following his Coast Guard career, Carlton Skinner served as the first civilian governor of Guam. G. William Miller, 65th Secretary of the Treasury, was a graduate of the Coast Guard Academy, and retired Vice Admiral Harvey E. Johnson, Jr. served as Deputy Administrator and Chief Operating Officer of the Federal Emergency Management Agency under President George W. Bush. Rear Admiral Stephen W. Rockin was appointed by President George W. Bush to serve as the Director of the Executive Residence and White House Chief Usher, beginning service on March 12, 2007, and continues to serve in the same capacity under President Barack Obama. Two Coast Guard aviators, Commander Bruce E. Malnick and Captain Daniel C. Burbank, have served as NASA astronauts. Signalman First Class Douglas Albert Munro was awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously, and is the only Coast Guardsman to ever receive this honor. In popular culture, in video games, the 2005 survival horror video game, Cold Fear, depicts a Coast Guardsman investigating paranormal events aboard a Russian whaling ship, and an oil rig later in the game. Flight Simulator X, acceleration features an EH-101 in U.S. Coast Guard colors. However, the USCG does not operate these aircraft. The U.S. Coast Guard appears as gameplay adversaries in Jaws Unleashed, including cutters and helicopters. Deadliest Catch, Alaskan Storm features the U.S. Coast Guard. In literature, a Coast Guard cutter and its commanding officer and crew figured prominently in Tom Clancy's books Clear and Present Danger, Without Remorse, and Executive Orders. Sinbad, a dog serving aboard the cutter USCG Campbell and WWII, who was enlisted and held the rank of Chief Petty Officer, was the first member of the United States Coast Guard to be the subject of a biography in George Foley's Sinbad of the Coast Guard in 1945. The Coast Guard training cutter, USCG Eagle, figures prominently in S.M. Sterling's book Island in the Sea of Time. In film, Fighting Coast Guard, a 1951 drama, depicts Coast Guard trained to help win WWII. Onion Head, a 1957 comedy, portrays Andy Griffith as a Coast Guard recruit. Thunderball, involves James Bond played by Sean Connery being hoisted by an HH-52 Sea Guard. Assault on a Queen, a 1966 film starring Frank Sinatra and Verna Lisi, featured USCG Andros Coggin. The Boatniks, a 1970 Disney comedy film, depicts Ensign Tom Garland, played by Robert Morse, as the commander of a small cutter on the West Coast. Satan's Triangle, a 1975 TV movie, involves a United States Coast Guard helicopter sent to answer a distress call from inside the Bermuda Triangle. The Last Flight of Noah's Ark, a 1976 Walt Disney movie. Elliot Gould and crew towed home in B-29 fuselage boat by a Coast Guard cutter. The Island. Latter-day Caribbean pirates capture the Coast Guard cutter USCG New Hope. Filming was on USCG Dauntless. Splash. Coast Guard helicopters drop Coast Guard divers into New York Harbor. Top Gun, Maverick and Goose's body are pulled from the ocean by a Coast Guard HH-3F Pelican. Overboard, 1987 comedy, features a Coast Guard cutter and crew intercepting a private yacht. License to Kill, 1989, James Bond captures a drug dealer while flying in a Coast Guard HH-65 Dolphin in Florida. Clear and Present Danger, a 1994 film, in which a Coast Guard cutter intercepts a drug-running ship. The Perfect Storm, 2000 film, depicted the rescue operations of the USCG CA Tamaroa as one of its subplots. Bad Boys 2, 2003 film, depicts counter-drug helicopters from the Helicopter Interdiction Tactical Squadron. Yours, Mine, and Ours, 2005 family comedy, Dennis Quaid plays a fictional U.S. Coast Guard Academy superintendent who marries a character played by Rene Russo. Together, they have 18 children. The Guardian, 2006 film, starring Kevin Costner and Ashton Kutcher, was based on the training and operations of Coast Guard aviation survival technicians. Pain and Gain, 2013 film, starring Dwayne Johnson and Mark Wahlberg, depicted the Coast Guard Deployable Operations Group in action. In television, the Coast Guard has been featured in several television series, including Baywatch, CSI, Miami, NCIS, Deadliest Catch, Dirty Jobs, Harbor Command, Burn Notice, and Miami Vice. Sea Hunt, Coast Guard involved in several episodes. Flipper, various Coast Guard HH-52 Sea Guard helicopters were used. Gilligan's Island, the passengers and crew were all rescued by the Coast Guard. Emergency. Coast Guard HH-52 Sea Guard helicopters and boats were used in various rescues. Boston Legal, the characters of Alan Shaw and Denny Crane, portrayed by James Spader and William Shatner, respectively, joined the Coast Guard Auxiliary. Coast Guard was a syndicated television series that aired for 3 seasons from 1995 to 1997 in the United States as well as overseas, where it was called Sea Rescue. The series followed Coast Guard personnel as they performed their missions. Cartoon character Popeye was in the Coast Guard after being a merchant mariner. He later joined the Navy. Unnamed Coast Guardsmen of a law enforcement detachment were featured in a Channel 5 documentary Royal Navy Caribbean Patrol. They were serving aboard HMS Manchester, a British Royal Navy ship combating drug smugglers in the Caribbean. Coast Guard Alaska, Search and Rescue, a series on the Weather Channel that features a Coast Guard search and rescue unit based in Kodiak, Alaska. Coast Guard Florida, Search and Rescue, a series in production on the Weather Channel that features Coast Guard search and rescue units based in Miami and Clearwater, Florida. See also: Coast Guard, AMVER, Chaplain of the Coast Guard Day, Joint Maritime Training Center, List of United States Coast Guard cutters, Maritime Law Enforcement Academy, MASC, National Data Boy Center, National Ice Center, North Pacific Coast Guard Agencies Forum, Patrol Forces Southwest Asia, U.S. Coast Guard Legal Division, U.S. Coast Guard Intelligence, United States Coast Guard Police, United States Coast Guard Air Stations, United States Coast Guard Stations, United States Coast Guard Officer Rank and Senior, United States Coast Guard Research and Development Center, related agencies, List of United States federal law enforcement agencies, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration Fisheries. Office for Law Enforcement, U.S. Customs and Border Protection, U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, U.S. Marine Corps, U.S. Maritime Administration, U.S. Merchant Marine, Notes, Footnotes. References. Further reading, Dolbo, Jim. The Coast Guardsman's Manual. Naval Institute Press, Annapolis, Maryland. ISBN A978-15911422188 A. Coast Guard, Observations on Progress Made and Challenges Faced in Developing and Implementing a Common Operational Picture, Testimony before the Subcommittee on Coast Guard and Maritime Transportation, Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure, House of Representatives Government Accountability Office, External links, U.S. Coast Guard website, About U.S. Coast Guard, Coast Guard Magazine, Coast Guard Manuals Online, Coast Guard Flags, USCG Homeport website. Coast Guard in the Federal Register, reports on the Coast Guard, Department of Homeland Security Office of Inspector General, a cooperative strategy for 21st century sea power, U.S. Coast Guard videos, Coast Guard personnel locator, how to join the U.S. Coast Guard, U.S. Coast Guard auxiliary website, Coast Guard channel, Coast Guard news, Congressional Research Service reports regarding the U.S. Coast Guard, USCG News, U.S. Coast Guard Networked U.S. Coast Guard Networked Group on LinkedIn, America's Waterway Watch, United States Coast Guard at the Wayback Machine.